This ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief, Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I'm Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I will be hosting today's session on racial equity, specifically the term brown bag and colorism. Very excited to have you with us here today. This session should be pretty good. I'm very excited about it. So let's move to the next slide, and I will hand it off to Mary Frances to get our welcome introduction going. Go ahead, Mary Frances.
Thanks so much, Chris, and welcome to all of the folks on the call today. Just want to kind of welcome you to this unscripted conversation, partially scripted conversation amongst colleagues that we work with. If we can move to the next slide, I just want to cover a bit of today's agenda. So after you are introduced to your facilitators, you'll notice on today's call, we've got a lot of facilitators because we wanted to bring a certain depth and breadth to this topic that is really important. We'll do that and then kind of pivot to learning objectives that I believe Chris will cover. We're going to cover our engagement agreements as well. Then Chris will also speak to modeling racial equity and what to do when something is wrong, even if you didn't know it was wrong, even if it wasn't intentional, but has caused harm. From there, we are going to just go over colorism at a higher level. And then we're going to talk personal. We're going to talk personal. We're going to talk professional. As I mentioned, there are about 6 of us that will be sharing our experiences with colorism, both personally and professionally. And of course, you're invited into that dialogue at any point in time, but you also don't have to say anything. You can just use this as a time to listen and reflect, and maybe something from one of the speakers today will resonate with your own personal experience. Chris, I believe I'm kicking it back over to you.
You very well may. Go ahead to the next slide, please, and we'll have folks introduce themselves. So Mary Frances, why don't you you're already talking, stick with it.
My name is Mary Frances Kane. I do use she, her pronouns. I'm with ICF. I've had the opportunity to work with a number of you through these trainings, and happy to be back. I also identify as Black. Masita?
All right, thank you. Hi, my name is Masita Dorley. I use she, her pronouns. I am with ICF and also work supporting the California project, and I use African American as my identifiable race.
Thanks, Masita. I'm going to do Alyssa introduction because she's not here yet, but Alyssa Parrish is also with ICF. She'll be with us at the end of the session. She, her, hers pronouns. She identifies as Asian and is from Des Moines, Iowa. Next slide. Hey, Melissa, you're on mute, but go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm Melissa Michael, she, her pronouns. I identify as Mexican American. I'm also with ICF, and I live in Fresno, California.
I'm going to go ahead and introduce Rajni because I believe she's joining us. But hello, everybody. I'm Maite Antello. I'm the third person that you see on the screen, but I'm going to introduce my colleague, Dr. Rajni. She and I work for Racial Equity Partners as associates and consultants. And Rajni identifies as Indian American and uses she, her, and they, them pronouns. And like I said, I'm Maite. Nice to meet you all. I'm a Racial Equity Partners associate. I'm also a psychologist. And my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I identify as Bolivian American, as I am the daughter of 2 Bolivian immigrant parents.
Thank you, Maite. Appreciate that. Talk a little bit through our learning objectives. So we're going to today talk a little bit about some real life examples of how California HCD and particularly myself, Stephanie Hirschberger, identified and corrected a racial equity issue. We want to model what that looked like so that if you see something, you kind of understand maybe what might need to happen as well. Then we're going to learn about really what colorism is and how detrimental that can then be, and then really deepen our understanding through the personal experience of that wonderful team that just introduced themselves on the last slide. So next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some of our engagement expectations. So during our racial equity sessions, we really want you to be present. Listen actively, engage with us and each other. The chat is yours. talk to each other, introduce yourself, say hello, ask questions, be engaged. We are in a Zoom meeting. Feel free to talk to us when the time is right. We also want you to maintain some mutual respect, that we have differing viewpoints, and to create a space that allows for that. We're not going to try to find resolutions today to these things, or solutions even, nor will we find a one-size-fits-all solution to any of this. It is way too complicated for that. Understand that we have this challenges the way that we have historically responded to homelessness. We're going to see ourselves as part of the solution to the issues today. Think about how we can prioritize our attendance for future sessions, and participate in the chats and polls. So those are expectations. We hope to keep it nice and clean. Next slide, please. This is my last big one here. So modeling racial equity. We had begun in the beginning of this year a series of office hour editions, basically, that were called the brown bag sessions. Those sessions came out of a desire for us to have more of the training and technical assistance that we do with the communities be in the office hour format, but to keep it separate and distinct from the office hours themselves. So they had a different feel, a different energy to them. And the idea was, bring your sack lunch and let's have a conversation during lunchtime. The idea did not work on several levels. One, we never did the session at a lunchtime hour. It was always in the morning. And two, the term brown bag has some racial implications that we were not necessarily clued into. When we became aware of them, we made a very quick response. There is no need to use that term. It was something that I've heard in corporate situations. You've probably heard in your own business or own world life that folks just use this term. And to some folks, it means a sack lunch. To other folks, it does not mean that. And it is a way to discriminate both inter and intra-racially. And we're going to hear about that today, exactly what that is like and how that can happen. So as soon as we were understood that that was an issue, we made a change and we turned that term away. We're not going to use that ever again. In fact, this is the last time I plan to ever see it on a screen. And instead, we started to use the term spotlight series. That's what we're doing. We're spotlighting an issue, we're talking it through, and we're working on it. So brown bag terms, you can see a few links here. There's a lot of history to them. You can do your own research and figure out and find other sources. These are two that came to us from our cultural anthropologists who actually brought the term to us as offensive and negative. So I encourage you to model this type of behavior. When you see something that doesn't feel right, it doesn't sit right, speak up, have those conversations and do the right thing. Make those changes when you need to. So with that, I am going to retire officially the term brown bag. I will never use it again from my lips, and want to say thank you for those of you that were part of helping make that change in real time with HCD. So with that, it is my pleasure to hand it to Mary Frances, who's going to take us to the next two slides. Go ahead, Mary Frances.
Thank you. So Slido is kind of our jam, and we do have our first poll question for you. So you can either whip out your camera phone and scan that QR code. You can also go to slido.com and enter 3690289, or you can just click on the link that I just dropped in the chat. The question is, colorism was mostly practiced as a form of discrimination through skin color stratification by, and select the answer that you think is correct. While y'all are in there, I see we've got one person that's joined, we've got 5 people. I'm actually gonna ask for Kristen to let me share my screen real quick. There we go. So y'all can see where we all lie on the end of the spectrum. So right now we've got about 6 folks that have participated. Looks like the top runner right now is all of the above. So the within racial groups against group members, whites against other groups, and people in the past. Looks like we're getting up there. If our facilitators are not going to participate, then we know why. We only have 10 respondents. Feel free to keep going folks can participate in the poll as long as they like. I'll keep it active for a little bit more, but we definitely want to hand it back over to Kristen. So I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can get back into the PowerPoint. And of course, all of the results from any Slidos that we do will be shared with you. And we can go ahead and advance to the next slide.
So, as I said, I'm Maite. Nice to see you all again. And what I'm tasked with doing, at least for right now, is just to set some grounding definitions, let's say, of what colorism is, even though Chris started us down that road already. But to use How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, by Dr. Kendi, as a starting point, I'd like to help us define colorism as basically a set of policies that are racist in nature and that are upholding this belief that the color of someone's skin makes some sort of quality about them better or worse, basically, right? So again, one definition could be racist policies that lead to inequities between light and dark people, supported by racist ideas of light and dark people. One distinction I want to make here is that in Kendi's work, what he says and what he talks about a lot is there is this combination of policies and behavior, right? Which is why you see in his definition, he talks about racist policies that lead to this inequitable treatment. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another way of defining colorism or saying more about it is colorism is something that happens all over the world. This is not just something that's happening in the United States. It is included in things that happen in Latin America, East and Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, Africa, and the US, as we've said. The history of that word, again, we don't have time to go into everything, but just to start, in 1983, there was a book called In Search of Our Mother's Gardens by author and activist Alice Walker, and she talks about defining colorism as, quote, prejudicial or preferential treatment of same-race people based solely on their color. And Walker gave it a name and marked colorism, again, the term colorism, as an evil that must be stopped. And I think I just want to take this opportunity to commend Chris and the ICF team for doing just that, for noticing something that was based in colorism and racist policies or racist behaviors that is now being stopped, literally. And so again, what we're doing today and what we're attempting to do with our behavior is to stop this color hierarchy, because it is, as you see here, pervasive. It's so pervasive that sometimes we don't even know that it exists, to Chris's point. You can be in conversation and hear terms and not know that there is some sort of racist history attached to some terms or some behaviors. So that's why, again, that's why we're here today. So colorism is deeply entrenched. It's, again, this preference of light skin bias over dark skin. So again, light is good and dark is bad. Color bias is implicitly and explicitly taught. So what we mean by that is it's implicit in that it's sort of part of your environment. And when it's so much part of an environment, you don't realize that you're taking it in. And it can be explicit in, for example, if you think of movies or people that are highlighted in media or stories, typically someone that might be a lead, to use a movie as an example, in a movie is likely going to be a light-skinned individual over a darker-skinned individual. And then again, this idea that we are all implicated and infected by colorism, which you are actually going to see a bit more about when we get into our personal stories about colorism and our experiences. Next slide, please. And segue.
Yes, thank you, Maite. I love segues. Go back one more slide for me real quick. So I'd love to, if anyone has any questions or anything they want to ask around colorism, the content, please do either unmute yourself or put it in the chat. But this session we really built to be around personal experience. So my personal experience was learning that the term brown bag had racial connotations and negative ones that I wasn't aware of. I educated myself based on that knowledge, worked with Stephanie and Janice and other folks in leadership at HCD, and we made the change. We saw something, we did something. We're now going to open up personal experiences, because everyone that is going to talk today has had some connection to colorism in their lifetime, which is really powerful. So I'm going to go ahead and take it back and give it to Maite to give us the first go. And we'll take a little break after each of these and have a conversation. So this is time for us to hear a story, hear how things affected us, and have a conversation. So if you feel compelled or would like to put something in chat or speak, please do. Maite, please educate us on your personal experience.
Thank you, Chris. So as you heard me say at the beginning of my introduction, I am the daughter of Bolivian parents. They came to the United States to go to graduate school, and I was born in the States, raised mostly in the United States, but also a lot of time was spent with me being raised in Mexico. So I have a very diverse background in terms of my upbringing, and I learned Spanish while living in Mexico, actually. And so what you see in this slide, I hope you can tell because I can always tell if this is too small, is a picture of album covers of two different songs, because I live my life in song and I can't help it, but these examples always come to me with music. And so my first example, and you see this album cover, is an album by Cri Cri, which is a popular children's song singer, basically in Mexico when I was growing up in the late 80s. And he had a song called Negrita Cucurumbe, which for those of you that don't speak Spanish, is basically a take on sort of a black child, or just a sort of nickname towards a black little girl. And what I was thinking about in preparing for my personal experience share was that when I was little, I went to a private American school in Saltillo, Coahuila. And so I was being taught in English and Spanish. And I was around Mexican children and children of all kinds of ancestry, etc. And I am darker in color. Let's say I'm not white. And so when I was out in the sun, I would get darker. And I had never really thought about my skin color until I was probably, I want to say in first grade. And I overheard somebody say, "Oh, there she goes, La Negrita Cucurumbe." And I knew the song because I love music and I had listened to these songs growing up. And when I heard it, I thought, no. And I will be the first to say that I was ashamed in that moment, because my first reaction is, no, I'm not Black. And then my second reaction was, why are you calling me that? And then as I was preparing for this conversation, I went back and listened to the lyrics of the song. And so what you see in the slide, which I will translate for you, is somebody responding to the Negrita Cucurumbe, who in the song is trying to go to the ocean and hoping that the waves will make her lighter. And so someone comes to see her walking on the beach and says to her, "But oh my goodness, what are you doing? Don't you see that you're so beautiful, Negrita Cucurumbe? You're beautiful, you don't need to do anything." So when I listened to the song again, I thought to myself, oh my God, the message in the song is actually better than I remember, but the experience of it was that I was being told that I looked dark, and I knew by the age of, again, 6 or 7, that that was bad, right? And I can't tell you that my parents taught me that or anything to that degree, but again, it's connected to this implicit learning that happens, but then and now that I think about it, with this explicit example of a song that is using that as a lesson, in essence, to teach children that are Black or darker that, but oh my goodness, you're beautiful, you don't need to change anything about yourself. And then that leads me to the next piece of this, and then I'll stop talking, which is the other album cover that you see is from Los Panchos, again, a very popular Latin American trio that I grew up listening to because my father loved them. And they have a song called Vagabundo, which means wanderer. And as I was preparing for this, I was listening to that song for different reasons. And there's a lyric in this song that says, "All I want is to see, I just want you, right? You beautiful woman." And the woman is being described as morena, which means a darker skinned woman, whether that's darker skinned like me. I'm not of African descent, but does that mean me? Or it could be somebody that is of African descent in Bolivia or in other countries. And what I thought to myself there was, oh, here's another song where we're actually celebrating darker skin, and that is what this singer wants. And so I use this as sort of an example of my own experience of things that can be both good and bad, and what that experience was like for me. And the last thing I'll say about this is that I think the colorism is so entrenched that the other thing that you see on this slide, which I almost forgot about, is that when I talk to some of the people in my family that live in Bolivia currently and talk about, when I get married and have children, their advice in a kind of joking manner is, well, you want to, you know, pick somebody that's lighter, because if you pick someone that's lighter, then you're bettering the race. You're making things better for the family. And again, from their perspective, sometimes it's a joke. And then I hear that and cringe even just telling you that story, but that is what it is. So thoughts, comments, or we can move on.
Thank you, Maite. Appreciate that. And I was very interested as I was looking at the slide that you would tell us what many of these Spanish words were, since I do not speak Spanish and it's not close enough to French that I do know to get me there. So thank you very much for that. Any comments or reactions to Maite's personal experience from anyone?
Thank you, Taylor.
All right, Maite, thank you very much. I believe Rajni Shankar Brown has joined us. Rajni, are you with us?
Hello, namaste, I am here.
Wonderful. It is your slide. Go ahead.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for being here in beloved community today to talk about this important topic. I have put kind of an assembly of various photographs of myself on this page. And I did that with intention, really to kind of demonstrate all of the shades, the spectrum I can be and I am during the course of a year. So it was really interesting, you know, even as a child, often, you know, my summers, whether they were spent here or in South India, I would get very, very dark. In fact, you know, some photographs of me, my complexion is extremely, extremely dark. And then there are other photographs of me where my complexion is extremely, extremely pale and white. And so it is really interesting, even when I have photographs that I'll bring often for teaching when I'm working with children and youth, they'll often think that they're different individuals just because the skin color is so diverse and different. And then they'll see my dimples and say, oh, that is you. So it's really interesting. But growing up, you know, colorism has always been really very, very embedded in a number of ways and very painful part of my own journey. And so when I was young, the messaging was clearly from a number of sources and really diverse communities as well, that dark skin was not beautiful. That was the messaging that I would receive. Now, sometimes that messaging was explicit. Other times it was implicit, right? And even through a hidden curriculum, if you will. The fact that, you know, during the summer heat, you know, people would say, oh, don't go right into the direct sun. And they would try to shift me and move me over into the shade, right? And I am a sun lover. So I would tend to, even as a kid, find the sunshine and stick my face right in it, you know? And so it was this kind of constant messaging, but also I really started to notice even, you know, so many of my Indian relatives, skin bleach was part of their daily products. And it was something so normalized that they didn't even question, right? So it was kind of slathering on face creams and it has skin bleach in it. And, you know, the older I got, of course, I started to become more knowledgeable and observant, and even noticing the array of commercials on TV when I go to India, showing white skin is beautiful and showing the bleaching products, especially during the daytime where many women may be at home. You know, it is really targeted kind of marketing and messaging. And so this, you know, as I've grown up, has been really very, very both perplexing and distressing, you know, really juxtaposed for me. But the interesting thing too is I felt colorism, and I have felt this in several ways, even, you know, being in spaces where, you know, it is predominantly white communities, and where, you know, I am treated differently, you know, often than others. And there's a lot of different biases. I think colorism is sometimes complex even to talk about because it is compounded with all of the other isms as well in so many ways, right? And so sometimes you start to see that, and it really is gets a little complex in that sense, but definitely the messaging is very troubling. I do a lot of studies with my own students now, and we look at from the 60s doll studies all the way to today. They've continued to do these studies and even internalized racism, how real it is. How many children, our babies, will point to the white child as the beautiful child, as the smart child, as the successful child. They'll use these positive kinds of adjectives, and then they will use adjectives on the other end. And to see our own babies that have internalized this, it shows, I think, the depth of how embedded it is in our systems and structures and policies and narratives and media and even in our homes, and how actively we have to work to dismantle all of that. I also included 2 quotations on here from my son, Valen Siddhartha, and my daughter, Ramila Sitara. And so one thing I've been really very intentional about is, since they were born, making sure that I emphasize the beauty of our melanin, that, our skin in all of its shades are beautiful, and we are to embrace that and fight against colorism. And I'm so proud, even when my own children have had really painful experiences in school, where even my daughter would pick up a darker shade crayon to color something that they were coloring if they were doing a person, people trying to correct her to say, hey, even children, right? Correcting or giving her a lighter skinned crayon to say, hey, this would be a lot prettier. And my daughter is able to now educate and say, actually, no, this is beautiful, right? And so I'm really, to me, that is the embodiment of hope. I hope that, as youth, they will go out and continue to educate, but moreover, that they will internalize the messages that all of our children and all of us as human beings should internalize. Our skin glows with the love of our ancestors. Amma, we are made of marvelous melanin. Absolutely, I think that is the truth, but we have a long way to go, and a lot more discussions like this that need to happen.
Thank you, Rajni, for excuse me. Thank you, Rajni, for sharing your personal experience and that of your children as well. I really appreciate that. Any thoughts or comments on Rajni's personal experience? I'll share one briefly. My niece, the light of my life, has a Black father and a white mother. And I find it really interesting. Every time we talk to her, the only thing that she really connects to outside of fish, because her father's a fisherman and she loves fishing, is she really connects to Moana, because Moana is like her. And that's important. That to her, she sees that. And so as a result, if you haven't seen Moana at least 1,000 times in my household, you haven't sat around my niece at all, because that's all she wants to do, is see someone with curly hair and a dark complexion that she can relate to, and just happens to love the water just like her. So those are important things for us to see. And I love that Rajni mentioned things like that. So thank you, Rajni. Anything else?
I will say, just it's interesting to hear, remembering my own childhood and hearing Rajni talk about her children, because I remember thinking when I was little, I wish there were more crayons available to me so that I could color something that looks more like me. But since I can't, then I'm going to do what I, use what I have. And I think I remember actually whenever Crayola came out with all the different skin color crayons, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I'm sure that is what it's connected to, right? Like the reaction is, where am I, right? And the validation of we're all beautiful, to Rajni's point. So great to hear about that.
Thank you, Maite. Appreciate that. Okay. Well, we're on time, and I'll keep us moving. Our next presenter is Masita. Masita, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. So my name is Masita, as shared in the introduction, and I'm just going to take a few moments just to kind of share my personal experience. I would say, I guess, growing up, I grew up in different places, but growing up here in the rural South. So I was born, as some may know, in Monrovia, Liberia, and that is a country in West Africa. And I really came from a rich lineage on both sides, both my mother's side and my father's side. And you can see their pictures on the bottom of the PowerPoint slide. My mother's family was from the Kru tribe, and my father's family was from the Mandingo tribe. And the father's left hand, the further left picture, is actually my grandfather, who was the tribal chief of 100 people, of a few hundred people rather, in Liberia, in a small village, who eventually turned that village into a hamlet called Blamasi Town that was named after my grandfather. And my father was next in line to be the tribal chief after he finished his studies, right? From NYU in criminal justice, because children of kind of that stature in Africa, they're sent usually to the US for their higher college education. And so I grew up until I was 8 years old in Liberia, in kind of a comfortable life, you know, where it wasn't about color. It was more so about birthright, because of the fact of, while skin color was notable, it was more your heritage was your proud, your badge of honor, your lineage. And so people cared more about if you were American Liberian, meaning if you were descendants of those who returned back to Liberia because they were freed slaves from America, or if you were original Afro-Liberian. And so while color was noticeable, you know, it's who's your birthright, who's your lineage, who's your family, who's your bloodline, where do you come from? When you introduce yourself, you would say, my name is Masita Dorley, I am the daughter of Abraham, and you would say their full name and then your mother's full name. And then if you needed to, you would say, you would go to your grandparents and say your family's tribe. So it was more so, you know, you were instilled and empowered to be just proud of who you were and where you came from. And it really wasn't until I came to America, as war was starting to break out, when I was 8 years old, that I was introduced to colorism. And I was introduced to the first phase of the fact that my complexion and the darkness of my skin was somehow not a preference for the overall majority society. And I started hearing things, you know, in school as, oh, you look good for a dark-skinned person, or you should stay inside so that you don't get darker, or why choose Snickers when you can have a Butterfinger to be accepted in a group, because Butterfingers is lighter and Snickers is darker. And, you know, as a teenager, you know, you already have kind of puberty and internal feelings and hormones and everything that you're dealing with. And then to put this, to kind of also have to deal with this complex issue does kind of unfortunately creates and starts planting the seed for self-doubt and low self-esteem and low value of self-worth, which is what I started to feel internally. You know, I questioned, why didn't I look like my mother? You know, why didn't I look like my aunts? Why didn't I look like my family members on my mother's side, who were all of lighter complexion and had light eyes, because their family was of mixed heritage, whereas I looked more so like the family members on my father's side, and that became an internal war within myself that really didn't dissipate until in my early 30s. It's funny when I put this picture of myself on this slide, folks are like, oh, Lord, Mercedes, your bangs is high. And one of the reasons was that I tried to grow my hair so long because of the fact that when it's down, it would cover my face, because I tried to hide myself because I started to not like the skin that I was in. And so all of my clothes were dark clothes that I wore. And even now that I'm wearing red lipstick, before I didn't wear lipstick because I didn't feel comfortable in that someone my complexion should wear anything bright that would cause themselves to be seen. And that impact of those comments and those interactions of what children probably may have heard in their own home from their adults that were around, or seen most definitely through the auspice of television and movies and music videos. That was when MTV were a thing, where there was a preference for those who were of lighter complexion or in close proximity to white. That really kind of just really impacted how I kind of grew up and thought about myself and saw myself in the eyes of others. So whenever something went wrong, it was always a self-internalization, as it was me, because like society says, Black is evil and white is good. And so I equated that with being dark is not good. So if something went wrong, you had to look within yourself first to see what you did wrong, versus maybe it could be someone else, and those type of internal complexes really cause barriers for self-growth and self-development, where I probably missed out on a lot of things because I self-isolated, because I didn't feel like I would be chosen or selected because I wasn't a standard, quote unquote, society of beauty, right? Because in Africa, in Liberia, where I was proud of my heritage, and I was proud of my wide nose, and I was proud of how I looked and who I am. When I came to America and started living in the rural South, that proud, started to dissipate with the comments and the feedback and their interactions, and everything has started to chip away at that, what was instilled in me as a child, but what then as I'm growing up in a different land and in a different space, became a recurring theme of that's not what entire society wants. And so it led to kind of some self-thought. And I think someone mentioned it, skin brightening, that was stuff that was mentioned, and that was stuff that was shared. You too can kind of lighten your complexion if you get some whitening cream, if you get some brightening cream, you could possibly do a nose job to make your nose more European looking. It may add a little bit more years to your face. Those are some of the things that were said to me, not by just outside people, but by people I knew, who I call family, that kind of, when they also immigrated, adopted the American values of what they perceived the standard beauty to be, because that was their way of fitting in, and they did it for survival. And for years, I had an internal complex of low self-esteem and low self-worth because of those comments and everything. And, the unfortunate lineage and stories of who my grandfather was and where I came from. And the fact that even my cousin was a former president of Liberia, that didn't matter because of the fact of, that I did not look as what the standard, quote unquote, of white beauty, could look like. And so even now, like in the workplace, when I reflect on promotions and different things like that. And I even shared with someone reflecting on when Barack Obama became president, and then Vice President Kamala became vice president. And folks were celebrating, even within our African-American culture. Yes, I still had a hesitancy because there's still a layer of complexity in that a Black person getting that high a position, in that they still don't represent me and who I look like. And will there ever be a day that someone of my complexion will break that glass ceiling in a workplace to get to a higher position versus someone who kind of have an ambiguous, close proximity to white representation, that is more acceptable than someone such as myself becoming president. You could become a senator, but that may be as high as you go. You may not rise to that type of level of government, because I don't know if America would be acceptable, ready to be able to accept someone in that position. And those things are those thoughts and those feelings and those, personal ideations were something that I truly had to overcome. And it really, wasn't until I was in my 30s that I kind of just started addressing the issue and just realizing that, and remembering what I was taught when I was in Liberia, and just realizing that self-internalized belief of low self-worth, and just kind of repurposing it and turning it around to not to ignore or hide my color, but to be proud of my color, and not to assimilate into the majority, but to be proud and normalize my difference, and to embrace my color diversity wherever I go, and to live in my truth and realize that, we are all a different tapestry of a beautiful array of hues that can contribute in many different aspects of society. And, I appreciate the fact that ICF and HCD is giving platform and space such as this to discuss, what some colleagues probably deal with in their professional and personal life, and maybe feeling like they're chosen over someone who may look different than them and something like that, but being able to have the space to discuss it and to share that this is my personal experience. This is where I came from versus this is where I am now. And that colorism, different from racism, is still important and is still a topic that needs to be discussed, both in personal life and as well as in the workplace. And as we continue to educate ourselves in regards to this specific topic, is only then that we're able to, kind of create social circles that includes people of different hues and different colors, that we can kind of help improve the diversity and the interaction and the engagement of people. So this is my personal experience growing up from a small village in Liberia and coming to America.
Thank you, Masita. And the first time you're on the ticket, we're all going to vote for Masita. Don't you worry about that. Any thoughts or reactions to Masita's personal? Okay. Thank you, Masita. I really appreciate you. Next up, Mary Frances, take it away.
That is a tough act to follow, but I will practice my motto that what's shared from the heart reaches the heart. And I'm actually going to start with a quote that's not up on the screen, dropped it into the chat for those not following the chat. It's a quote from sociologist Melvin Oliver. Oliver says that race in itself means nothing. The markers of race, skin color, hair texture, the things that we identify as the racial markers mean nothing unless they are given social meaning and unless there's public policy and private actions that act upon those kinds of characteristics. And that kind of ties back to what Maite opened up with as she was talking about colorism. So first and foremost, and I think it's kind of fitting that I'm following Masita, and thank you, Masita, for sharing your personal experiences. Very powerful there. I am a Black woman. To be clear, I'm not monoracial, I'm biracial. I think that's an important piece to note, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. My dad is dark skinned. He's down in the bottom right-hand corner. He is Geechee. He's from South Carolina, a few miles north of Charleston, South Carolina. And he's a Geechee Black man. He is monoracial from the South, and he doesn't have any known lineage outside of South Carolina. When Masita was sharing about her own lineage and being able to identify specific tribes, it made me a little bit sad because I don't have that as a Black woman in America. I don't have the ability to say, this is where this part of my family comes from, because there's no records. The records end for my family in about 1890, which is when we were able to trace as far back as possible. So I know a little bit about my family from South Carolina. On the flip side, I did mention that I'm biracial. My mom is white. She's also sandwiching me is my mom and my dad in that bottom right-hand picture. And you know, in comparison to my dad, she is able to trace all of her lineage. There's documents from, you know, the Monitor and the Merrimack and the National Archives from like a great-great-grandfather who came from Ireland in the midst of the potato famine. But one thing is clear for me and my experience. My parents have been married for 50 years, going on 51 this year. Interracial marriages were not popular. They weren't common, even in Washington, D.C., somewhere that is kind of positioned as being in the North. And I felt like an anomaly most of my childhood. Elementary school, I went to a predominantly white school in Georgetown, part of Washington, D.C., and then transitioned into junior high school and to a predominantly Black school in Southwest DC. Y'all probably don't know or care about the zip codes in DC, but there was a very stark difference in poverty levels, housing types, and just general like racial ethnic demographics. When you look at like the upper quadrant of Northwest in Georgetown compared to the lower quadrant in Southwest. And I felt like an anomaly because there weren't other kids that looked like me. It was one or the other. It was Black or it was white. And I grew up in a predominantly low income neighborhood in Northwest DC, which is now magically a very high income neighborhood as gentrification has swept through the city over the last couple of decades. One thing that I want to say about my skin color is, yes, I felt like an anomaly, and it took me many, many, many years and lots of dinner time conversations about race and experiences at my dinner table. My mom may be white, but she knew before I knew that the world would always see me and only see me as a Black woman. I cannot pass for white, although many people do often think that I am Spanish speaking, which is fine with me. But she knew this, and she made it a point to really have these difficult conversations to the best of her ability and to continue to grow and learn. And also my father, growing up in the Deep South, growing up in segregation, growing up where, you know, many days he was not able to go to elementary school because he did have to pick cotton and do sharecropping so that he could sustain or help sustain his family. My skin color comes with an immense amount of privilege because of the proximity that I have to whiteness, because of the fact that I do have a white mother and white family members. It's still melanated nonetheless. And I love what Rajni was sharing about how she changes shades throughout the year. That is the case for me too. In my state right now, I've been not intentionally tanning, but tanning nonetheless. And I will continue to get darker over the summer, and that darkness will go away. Now, what I want to talk about now is the three little people on the screen. So first up, we have Milo. Next up, we have Mason. Mason and Milo are my twin boys. They're 5 going on 6 years old. And I know this is about colorism, but for most people who see Milo, they see him as being Asian and Black. Milo is not Asian, although I love it as a compliment. He is, I guess, you know, a quarter white. These are my IVF babies. My wife and I were very intentional about picking an anonymous donor. He happens to probably be 2 or 3 shades darker than my dad. We were aiming with intention. We wanted representation of myself, of my wife, and of, you know, our Blackness. We appreciate it. We're proud of being Black. And we ended up with 2 kids that look completely different. Some people say they look alike, but Milo is more dark skin. He has a different texture of hair. He also looks Asian because he has Down syndrome. So he has what's called epicanthal folds. Mason, on the other hand, looks like my twin. I didn't put up a baby picture because that's what I looked like as a kid, except my hair was like a little bit longer. And then what's interesting, the third picture, that's my nephew. Now this is where the colorism piece gets interesting for my family. My nephew, my sister is working on his paperwork because his dad is, he is a member of the Wasamasa tribe of Varnertown Indians. So my nephew's name is Kane Varner. He carries that name, he carries that bloodline. And what's interesting about the Wasamasa tribe in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, and Varnertown Indians is that they are very uniquely diverse. They represent multiple bloodlines from different tribes. They do have state recognition. They do not have federal recognition, but they make up the Etiwan, the Catawba, the Cherokee, Edisto, and Santee tribal nations there. What makes them even more unique is that as a state recognized tribe in the state of South Carolina, they actually recognize fully the depth of diversity that they have. And that includes Afro-Indigenous members, they have Asian Indigenous members, they also have European Indigenous members because there was a lot of mixing, right? A lot of folks that happen to fall in love and have kids, and they are who they are. So I share that to say that, you know, leading back with that quote that I dropped in the chat and read aloud earlier, color doesn't mean anything. You can't always tell who a person is, what their experience is, what their makeup is like, right? Because at least from my dad's side of the family, I can't tell you where we're from. I have some assumptions. I know that we have a history connected to slavery and plantations in South Carolina, but there's no real way for us to put a fingerprint on where we come from because that lineage has been erased. That's my personal story, but I want to share about my professional experience. As I grew into adulthood and recognized the type of privilege that I had, growing into, you know, not just a TA provider, but, you know, homelessness service provider over 15 years, I saw colorism play out in some of the most unimaginable ways. And one example that I want to share with you has to do with using privilege for good. And I mentioned that I have that proximity to whiteness. At a former job, I was in a leadership role. Got to work with lots of bureau chiefs and division chiefs. And as Masita talked to so eloquently earlier, the darker you are, the harder it is to climb and elevate into leadership roles. You almost have to work twice as hard, even though you shouldn't. And one of my colleagues found herself elevated into a leadership role. And the director of the department I was working for at this time accidentally forwarded an email. And in this email, it contained a lot of what I would consider to be microaggressions, but also micro inequities. And I believe it was unconscious. We were doing a lot of racial equity work. The statements made in the email weren't overtly nasty or critical, but it was really subtle. And what it did was it sent a message that this division chief, who was in an elevated position that was probably Masita's complexion, was not valuable, or her ideas weren't important. So that micro inequity was sent in an email, and it was actually an exchange amongst this white leader with other white leaders talking about my Black colleague that got forwarded to about 800 of the department's staff. And I had a decision to make. I could be really uncomfortable and not say anything, or I could take a chance and use some of the privilege that I know that I have that my colleague didn't necessarily have, as she was the target of this email that had now been shared, embarrassing her amongst all colleagues, subordinates, and folks across the department. And I made a decision to do something different. And I didn't know if I was going to lose my job or not, but I did know that, like, unless we say something and really speak up for one another, and that goes beyond colorism, that extends across racial ethnicity lines. You know, I decided to do something, and I didn't hit reply all or anything crazy like that. But what I did do is I forwarded that email, and I called out the micro inequity. And I outlined exactly what was wrong with what happened. And when I tell y'all, like, I had to sit and type and like delete and like reread and rewrite this email, because I sent it to about 50 members of higher leadership. And then I staged like a mini virtual walkout. I'll save that story for another time, but it was in follow up to this because I didn't feel like the reaction provided, or the apology that my coworker got was very performative. That's probably one of the reasons how I ended up in this space. But, you know, I see it happen all the time. When I see it happen, whether it's me being invited to a panel to speak, I want to know who's on that panel, because you're not going to tokenize me as a light-skinned Black woman to basically hold down other Black-skinned women or brown-skinned women or Native women or Asian women, which is kind of like how this thing today organically happened. We were having a conversation, and it's like, let's not do a training. Like, let's just talk. Let's just share from the heart so that we can reach the heart. And let's have this wildly diverse panel of colleagues that have such rich experiences. And we had a similar conversation and said, you know what, like, this is the approach. Let's just talk about what we experienced, because some of you might have experienced it. But with that, I think that's enough for me. I really am looking forward to hearing from our next speaker. Who's up next?
Thank you, Mary Frances. And as you were telling that story, I put it in the chat. I don't like ABBA, but take a chance. I knew you were gonna take that chance, because that's the content of your character. And thank you for sharing that. That was very powerful. I'm gonna, in honor of time, I'm gonna move forward because I do want to hear from the rest of our guests today. Melissa Michael, you are up next.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Melissa Michael. As I mentioned earlier, I identify as Mexican American. And I just want to point out that I know that term maybe not be used as much as somebody who says maybe they're Latina or Hispanic. And I think there's a different story that we can go into that, or even as a Chicana. But what I do want to point out and start with is just that in our culture, or with Mexican Americans or Latinos, we really don't identify as a race, and to use labels or color classifications that have been tied to like our hair type, skin color, facial features. And so sometimes you have these words that are used as terms of endearment, but oftentimes have like a negative connotation. So some of the words that I have up there is güera, and I just realized that I spelled that wrongly. Usually it's a G-U-E-R-A. So maybe we can fix that for the next one. But güera or blanca, which means more of those facial features of being really light complected, light eyes, light colored hair. Then we have negrita, which is more of the darker color, darker features, maybe those of an indigenous Mexican population. And then you have your morenas, which are again darker features, but not as dark. And then we've also used like China or Japonesa, when we have somebody, and I'm going to talk about family members that may have like the almond shaped eyes, may have more of an Asian look to them. And so as kids, we've kind of all grown up with those nicknames. And I think it's something that sticks with us as we grow up. So I have two pictures up here. There's one picture of me on the left-hand side. That's with my paternal cousins. And as you can see, I'm one of the darker ones there. And then next to me with the kid who has his eyes closed, that's my favorite cousin, George. We are about a month apart, but he was always, the light one, so the güero, and I was always the negrita growing up, are the darker one. Same experience on my maternal side, where it's my cousin Jason. He's a few years younger than me, but as you can see, we're still from the same pretty much bloodline, other than the other parent. But just the skin color and the difference within, one family there. So my grandparents, they're both actually were born in the United States, or on my maternal side, they were born in Texas. On my maternal side, my grandma was actually born here in California. I had came across, it was really cool, seeing the visa papers from her grandparents. And so she wasn't born yet, and that was in the early 20s. But I was talking to my aunts before, and then called one up recently, because I was like, hey, can you tell me the story about grandma? I would call her Grandma Lita, because I remember you were telling me that because she was güera, that they would send her into the stores, or would send her into town. And my aunt was like, yeah, because she was güera, because she was so light complected, as they're traveling through different places, whether it's from Texas to Arizona to California, because she was so light complected, she got that preferential treatment. She was never discriminated against. She wasn't looked down like as a dirty Mexican, with some of the words that we've heard before, because she could go into the stores and make the purchases. So she's, at a young age, 9, 10, 11, going in and making the purchases, because the adults of the family weren't able to go into the stores because of the discrimination, and depending at also to what town they went in with. So, it's just those labels that we have that are growing up, that yes, they are those terms of endearment, but they also continue to live with you. And I think the way that you see yourself growing up. On both sides of my family, I was the first to graduate from college. So on both my paternal and maternal side. And I think that was hard, or kind of different to me, because, growing up, we see that most of the people that are of Hispanic or Mexican background, we know that we're seeing that those that have the white-skinned, we call them white-skinned Mexicans, we'll see those more as far as like the politicians, the business people, those who we see on TV. I didn't grow up speaking Spanish, and I think it was because of my grandma, who is in the bottom corner right here, right left-hand corner. She kind of had a discrimination towards Mexicans. And I remember she would tell me, well, we're not those kind of Mexicans. And I was just really taken back by that, trying to figure out, well, what are those kind of Mexicans mean? And my grandma and my grandpa, great people, love them, but they grew up in a ranch, and there was a lot of field work. And so and my grandma was probably one of the first female foremans, and she will talk to this day about how she was amazing at that job. And I think now, even so, that she has a little bit more of that dementia, she goes back to talking more in the terms of the 30s and 40s. So I'll see a lot of maybe the racism words come out of her. And I think I'm not saying it's right, but understanding that context of why she was so, adamant about, we're not those kind of Mexicans, or stay out of the sun, or why am I, for me, why was I so dark? Because I probably was the darkest out of our family members. But I think it was because of what I just said, is that the white-skinned Mexicans were those who were seen amongst the most powerful, the more successful, where I think I had my grandparents who didn't want me to grow up to be, hardworking in the field. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think they had a bigger dream for me, a goal for me getting to college. I remember my grandpa feeding me a lot of just history and the newspaper articles, and he would quiz me all the time just so that I could, I guess, rise above. But I think it was also too a lot of the outlook where I had against other people of my own background. So things where I'm like, oh, okay, well, I don't want to be like that person. So a lot of my friends tended to be white growing up. And I think I lost a lot of that culture because of that outlook that I think that my grandparents had with us. Like I said, my grandma didn't speak Spanish to me. Even my Lita, who spoke a lot of Spanish, she wouldn't speak it to me. She would make sure that I knew English. So there's a little bit of that background. I think I'm going off topic a little bit, but going back to maybe some of the family biases, even within our own family. So looking at that same crime, different punishment. I had another cousin, Charlie, who was maybe a year and a half younger than me. And he was, when we were younger, probably the same skin complexion. And then my cousin, Jason, so the little cousin on my maternal side, where they would like get in trouble and do the same thing. For some reason, girls didn't get in trouble because, we were perfect, I guess, to them. But the boys would get in trouble. And it was like, wow, I would notice that maybe, Jason was, go to another room, but Charlie would get spanked. And it was like, why? Like, it just, I didn't understand that. And I was like, oh, it's the same punishment. Like they were both outside doing something they shouldn't have been doing, but yet that punishment is different. And I think even now we've seen that, and it's interesting, and probably getting a little too personal, but I think it's interesting now too, that I use my cousin Charlie and my cousin Jason because they both got in trouble with the law. And even so, both went to prison, where Charlie had received this longer sentence, whereas Jason didn't. Not the exact same crime, but along the same route. And it's just like, wow, like, look at how that plays out from when we were children to adults. I think a couple other people also mentioned how much they love the sun. I love the sun. I used to love to be in the sun. So, my aunt said, why are you so dark and stay out of the sun? But it was done in a negative way, which I didn't understand. And again, me not understanding, but from what they saw growing up, whereas I don't know if they meant to see it more as a protection of me so that I could succeed in the world. So I wasn't facing that discrimination. But I didn't see that, and I didn't understand that. As I got older, my hair got curlier. My dad would always tell me, brush your hair, because it wasn't straight. My dad to school in Tranquility, which is a rural area here in California. And a lot of times they were very discriminated against. My mom and dad never had that opportunity to go to college. It just wasn't taught to for them. It was either trade school or field work. And I think because of that is what my dad tried to instill on me as far as being more white facing Mexican, where the hairs are straighter. And I was like, I love my hair. It was curly. Pocho, the term that my cousin used, because like I said, a lot of my friends were white. The schools that I went to, the magnet schools that my parents had put me in, to get me to be, I guess, again, the first one to have a college degree, to have a standing chance, to have those opportunities that they didn't have, where I lost a lot of my connection. I lost a lot of my language. And my cousins would call me Pocho, which basically meant brown on the outside, but white on the inside, or coconut. So there's that, and there's that, some family biases. And even recently, I'm going to say 20 years ago, when I got married, my husband is biracial. He is Black, Mexican, and he also has some Afro Latino in him too as well. And that wasn't the issue growing up, or even with my family. I think what hurt me the most is when my daughter was born, and you can see her right there in the picture, and just happened to catch this picture when I brought her home to my mom's house. And my grandma and I love her for everything she is and done and given to us. But when she looked at her, not, oh, what a pretty baby, not healthy. Her first comment to my daughter was, well, at least she's not that dark. And I was like, wow. And I think that is sometimes the struggle that sometimes, our families have when we're looking at colorism. I think this could probably be, I can't speak for any race, but any other race, but I think with the Hispanic community, Latino community, is still looking at and holding that respect of how do you not correct your family without looking at maybe, starting that argument or, alienating older family members, especially because with our family, our family ties are so tight. And it was like, okay, how do I talk to my grandmother about that? Or any other family member. So how colorism affects that too, as well. So as concluding this, so in finding the light, so my daughter in the picture there with my grandma is in this next set of pictures with the purple background. That's her headshot. She is now living in New York, pursuing her musical theater passion, all the way across the country from me. Miss her all the time. But I remember in one of her, she read to us one of her essays on, it was not so much about colorism, but about the roles and that were out there for her. And I think it can also go into a little bit of that projection that we have for family, maybe some of that, that fighting that my husband and I, or that protection with my children, because they were the darkest of all the other cousins. Their hair was always curlier. She has the wider nose, some of those what would be considered Black features. She has a little bit more of that. This picture I'm looking at too, I think they lightened her up, but I remember she was saying that she was afraid to go after roles where it was the light-skinned person predominantly played by white actresses with, the blonde hair. Thankfully she had a great theater instructor that told her, hey, look beyond this. The first one was when she did Little Shop of Horrors. She was going to audition as one of the urchins because they had traditionally were people of color that played those roles. And her theater teacher was like, or her theater instructor, I don't remember where she got one at, was like, no, you need to go for Audrey. So she got the lead role of Audrey, which was predominantly a white role. Then the next role was Chicago, which was Roxy, was also the platinum blonde, and changing that way. So I think her opening up more and trying to look more beyond the color of what these roles are, but what she can bring to it is, I think, maybe where we as parents have taught our children to as well. And then, so, finding the light. So it isn't always positive. I remember when In the Heights came out, movie that came out last year that was supposed to come out before the pandemic, familiar with this too as well, because my daughter was also played one of the lead characters in that role, loved it, great Latino music, just a good feel, just a good vibe. And I just remember after the movie, I was like, yes, this is so awesome. This is so exciting. Usually I'm used to seeing people that look like me, in the background, or we're coming from a crime-ridden neighborhood, which this was still, a New York neighborhood, but it just gave a different feel to it. But yet it also brought the reminder that, colorism is still, rampant thing within our Latino communities, especially within the Afro-Latino communities, when we're looking at people who, are Dominican Republic, Puerto Ricans, like really looking at all the shades. And I think just being conscious of what we're portraying, with the work that's happening in TV. Sorry that I'm using TV and theater so much, but that's kind of my light. But also looking back to, the roles that I had and that I looked at growing up into, looking around and saying, hey, what can I do? What are the people that look like me? What do they do, in the world? And just finding that, I think, example, but also I think as we fight past colorism, I think we're also, what's that next step for those that maybe not look like me, but have that same experience too as well. So I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Melissa, for sharing all of that. Very powerful stuff. We're going to move to our next and final presenter this afternoon. That's Alyssa. Go ahead, Alyssa.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I was late. I would have loved to have heard everyone's stories. Melissa, thank you for sharing most recently. And I came in towards the end of Mary Francis's, so I'm sure it's been a great session so far. I don't know if my name was introduced at the beginning, but my name is Alyssa Parrish. My pronouns are she, her, and I am Asian. And I actually specifically say I'm Asian and not Asian American, because I am actually still struggling with what that means. So I think I've heard a lot of different definitions of Asian American over time. And one of them that has stuck with me for a while is that an Asian American is someone who was born in America. So they are Asian of Asian descent, but they were born in the United States. As you can see on this slide here, I was not born in the United States. I was actually born in South Korea. I was adopted when I was 3 months old. And so I am still struggling with that identity of, am I Asian American or am I Asian? And right now, for me, what feels most comfortable is saying that I'm Asian. I am absolutely American as well. I was naturalized when I was 3 or 4 years old. So I don't know anything other than America, really. But for me, that title is still something that I am exploring and learning about. So as you can see in the pictures, like I was adopted when I was 3 months old, and my parents are white. In the pictures with my brother, you can see that he is also Korean. He is also Asian. He was also adopted. We are only 3 months apart. I was adopted first. My brother came 17 months later. So if you want, I was a psych major. So if you want to talk about birth order, where you were once the oldest and only child, you go from that to being the youngest and not the only child anymore. There's something to be said for that. It might be why I showed out when I was younger. I don't know. But as you can also see, my brother and I were the only people of color in our immediate family. So on the lower left corner there are my maternal grandparents. So those are my mother's parents. And those 3 little people with them are actually my 3 children. So they are biracial, they are white and Asian. I have been told that people can see the Asian in them. I cannot, but I think part of that goes back to, I'm 100% Asian. And so I see that in myself every day, but for them, they are, half Asian. And I also am not used to being able to look at my parents and say, well, I got my nose from her, and my ears from him, and my eyes from her. Like, that's not a thing that I've ever been able to do. So to look at my children now and say that, I can't. Like, I don't see that. I heard Mary say a little bit around like proximity to whiteness, like that is definitely, I mean, for all intents and purposes, I grew up in a white household. My parents are both white. They picked out neighborhoods that were majority white. My schools were white. So I definitely have that privilege of growing up in what can be described as a white household. There's also the model minority myth, which I'm not going to get into today, but I think that has definitely afforded me some kind of privilege. But I think there's also a sense of blindness that has come with just my life in general. I mean, there have been times, I remember when I was applying for college and we were talking about scholarships, because one of the things my dad told me was don't borrow more money than you need. Did I listen? I didn't. But one of the things that he suggested I do is look at scholarships for minorities. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm not a minority. And so it was in those moments where I'm like, oh, but I am. And I think that the only times that I have remembered that I'm a minority is when it has been specifically called out for me, up until probably the last couple of years. So like, I have been mistaken for an Alaska Native when I've been in Alaska. I've been mistaken for a Hawaii Native by a Hawaiian Native. I've been asked if I'm Chinese. I've been approached and like people have tried to speak a different language to me, assuming that I speak a different language until they realize like, oh, she doesn't speak that, she speaks English. There was one trip that we went on as a full family when my brother and I were 11 or 12. And my mother's brother spent a year in Japan in college teaching English and met a Japanese woman, and they are married. They live in Tokyo. And so when we went over to Korea, we spent a week in Korea and a week in Japan. And I won't ever forget this. So my aunt is Japanese, and we were walking down the street in Korea with her, and people were trying to speak Korean to my aunt who is Japanese. So like they either couldn't tell that she was not Korean, or they didn't care that she wasn't Korean and just assumed that she spoke Korean. But when we went to Japan, my brother and I would be walking with my aunt, and Japanese people would not even try and speak Japanese to my brother and I, and they would to my aunt. So there was just a level of awareness that Japanese folks had that it seemingly Korean folks did not. So that was interesting to me. And one of the pieces before I became okay with the fact that this was going to be just more of like a open conversation and sharing of personal stories, I Googled like what it was like colorism in Asian, just to see what showed up. And there was actually one essay that showed up. I looked through it. A lot of it didn't resonate because I was not raised in Asia. So they were talking a lot about colorism specifically in Asia, between and among different Asian nations. But one of the things that stuck with me is this quote from the essay that said, "It's okay to be Asian as long as you are the right kind of Asian." Specifically that you must be light, have big eyes, and a body that is at least 20 pounds lighter than average. So that essay showed or clarified that colorism between and among Asian people is not necessarily that they want to become white, but they're reporting like the desire to look like rich Asians, because light Asians meant that you weren't working in the fields, you weren't a laborer. So that was just a piece that, again, like I don't have personal experience about because I didn't grow up in Asia, but resonated with me as a person in the United States living as an Asian. I think the last thing I would just share is that, and I think I said this earlier, of, you know, I haven't always owned the fact that I'm a woman of color, and that is privilege that I have, being in proximity to whiteness and all of those pieces. But I also think that being raised by white parents, they are parents at heart, right? So their belief was, you are our child, that is how we see you, and nothing else matters. And so they just believed that that protection of them loving us, both of us, my brother and I, unconditionally, and only seeing us as their children would just like protect us, and that the world will see us that way too. And that's the only way that they would see us. And that for me has been the hardest thing that I have struggled with over the last several years, I would say. Like even yesterday, I saw my parents, not yesterday, the holiday is messing me up. Sunday, saw my parents for Father's Day. And I was kind of talking about this session that we were going to talk about colorism. And the look on their faces was very clear that they didn't understand why I would be presenting on a session or sharing a story about a session around colorism. And that is hard. That is hard to navigate through when the people who don't understand you are like your parents, right? And so just trying to navigate through being a woman of color in America, being not a Black woman and not a white woman, but something in between, but also having very white parents who felt like they protected me from whatever it is they needed to protect me from by not talking about it. So I think I'm going to stop there, knowing that we only have 4 minutes left.
Thank you, Alyssa. Really appreciate that. All right, so we'll move to the next slide. Mary Frances, would you like to kick us off?
I would. Y'all can join in the Slido. I'm going to ask that Kristen stop sharing for just a moment so I can pull it up. One word or phrase after today's session, and I will share my screen so you can see the word cloud grow as it comes in. Seeing a range here: enlightened, emotional, warm, intimate, vulnerability, identity, sad, vulnerable, enlightened, all circling around powerful. Poll will remain active for a few more minutes, and I'll turn it back over to Chris so we can close out.
Thank you, Mary Frances, and thank you all for joining us for this entire session. We did not have enough time for discussion amongst ourselves. We had way too many personal stories, but those personal stories, I think, were so very important to what we wanted to express in this session. So I am so grateful to all of our presenters for being with us and for you all sticking with us. Happy to entertain any questions or comments in the chat. But we are going to begin to wind down. So thank you for attending this session. We are going to have more racial equity sessions internally and externally that we want to make sure that folks have access to. So do keep up with that. We will send out listserv messages. We'll also send out our training website for folks to sign up for those things. This one was internal to HCD. We wanted to give you, as HCD folks, a chance to hear these conversations. We're going to do the same one July 15th externally for a larger audience. But even though you've heard the stories, I bet you'll still learn some things. So please do join us there if you wish. With that, we're going to conclude today's recording. Thank you very much. A short 3-question survey is going to pop up. Please do answer that. We look at those responses and we do change sessions or create new sessions accordingly. So Kristen, go ahead and stop record.